Okay, I'm going to start off by giving an intro to what out-of-body experiences are, and then I'm going to go through some of my own experiences and then some of the research and science that I've been involved with, both in general with the out-of-body experience, but also to kind of wider areas of psychical research. So to start off with, I thought it'd better kind of outline what I'm not talking about. So I'm not focusing on sleep paralysis based experiences. Maybe some of you have heard about people who have this experience of being frozen, basically waking up in paralysis and then having some kind of experience in that state. I tend to find that those kinds of experiences are not as objective and not as coherent as out-of-body experiences in other contexts, like cardiac arrest and things like that. I'm also not talking about lucid dreams. I'm not a lucid dreamer. My experiences happen when I'm in a waking state, so I'm basically just in a relaxed, calm, usually sometimes physically exhausted, which is very good for inducing the experience. So sometimes it's in that state. And although I'm very interested in remote viewing, and I might touch on it a little bit, my focus isn't on that either. So my focus is on an experience of being completely independent of the physical body, feeling like you're an independent self of some form that can travel and move and do different things in the context of kind of like a spirit, kind of like a living spirit. That's more what I'm talking about. So it's not even necessarily focused around where your physical body is. Many of my experiences happen far away from my physical body, right from the first moment. I don't even always have this experience of coming out of the body that many people describe. But I'll go through the whole sort of process and journey. So it kind of started for me with this book, Out-of-Body Experiences, a Handbook by Jani Lassila. I'd had a few spontaneous out-of-body experiences. I was about 12 years old and I started to find myself around 500 meters from where I lived. So there was no sense of leaving the body, no classical things that we associate with an out-of-body experience. I would just find myself at another location for a few moments and then the experience would end and I would find myself back in my body. Now I didn't know what this was, I didn't know what context to put it into. So I started to research, and this was the first book I found, which was looking at work with Ingo Swann, who some of you might know is a famous remote viewer. You can see up there I've got a couple of example targets. You can see this was the target, and then here is basically what Ingo Swann drew, and the same here, what he drew and the original target. So that was from Jani Mitchell's research. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about the history and references in like old writings, etc. And one of the early references, people often wonder where it all came from and how far back these kinds of experiences go. Well, this is actually a reference from the Bible that talks about a man who they say they don't know whether he was in body or out of body when he travelled to the I think it was the third heaven, yeah. Which in biblical sense, the third heaven would be the spiritual realm, because they saw the sky, for example, as one of the heavens. So they had three distinct heavens, as you can see in the diagram. Okay, so another early influence on my interest was the writer Oliver Fox. That was a pseudonym. He wrote under various names, but what I found interesting about him was he was specifically writing about London, and as I grew up in London, a lot of my experiences were focused around areas that I was familiar with. So I started to realise that the area that you grow up in, or the area that you have a strong emotional bond to, is often the area that you'll find yourself in an out-of-body experience. And that still holds true today. So even when I'm teaching people how to do these kinds of things, I still often reference that emotional bond or emotional connection that we have with places. So I think, the place that you're most drawn to is often the place you'll find yourself having an experience. Some of you also might know the early writings of Hereward Carrington and Sylvain Muldoon. their book, Projection of the Astral Body, was for a long time considered the classic book on out-of-body experiences and astral projection. They were the first two to actually do research really into the subject in any depth. Howard Carrington was a parapsychologist, and Sylvan Muldoon was a practitioner, was someone who was having out-of-body experiences. And he wrote to Carrington, and they ended up meeting and ended up writing the book together. So it's a combination of science and the actual experiences of Sylvan Muldoon. So these are a couple of illustrations from the book, and I think they're interesting because for a long time this idea of like a silver cord and multiple bodies that come out of the physical body was really, really popular, and still in some circles today we still get this idea that there's multiple bodies and that we're kind of like a Russian doll, and that it comes out of us and then goes to another location. Now I think over time, when we actually look at the research and we get into things more, it seems less likely that that's the case. Sorry. So also things like the silver cord, you'll hear it talked about a lot in the literature, especially esoteric literature. But I think the interesting thing is when you actually look at the research of experiences that people have, it only comes up in the region of between literally no occurrences through to about 4 to 6%. So we're talking about a very, very small percentage of people actually have this. Then when we get into things like the body, the body is not always present either, but I'll talk more about that as we go on. So we were just talking about this over lunch, but Alex Tannis was another person who I came across. This was in the 80s. He was doing research at the American Society for Psychical Research, and he was one of the people who was able to consistently get positive results in a laboratory setting. He was able to go from one location to another and perceive certain details of what was there. I've got an image. This is the setup that they were using. It was quite hard to get this image, so Cullen Cooper in the UK got hold of this for me because he visited the centre recently, and this is actually the original setup. It's still there, they haven't changed anything. And what he had to do was in an out-of-body state. He was supposed to come from into the front of this contraption and basically put his consciousness or his out-of-body head, whatever you want to call it, into the kind of circular area. The idea was that you could only see the target in a particular way when you were looking from exactly a particular point. So the reason that the experiment was set up like that was because if he could see the target as it was perceived from that particular point, it would give some suggestion that there was actually some kind of visual perception looking from a particular point. If he saw it more from a distance, it would suggest something different. So I think this was an attempt to understand what was going on in terms of the visual side of the experience, and I think this is still something that hasn't been finalised or looked into in any real depth to this day. So this is what really interests me, like how do we perceive and how do we see during an out-of-body experience. This is Keith Harary, who was another person who took part in some research, and he basically was trying to influence physical reactions, so in people, in animals, and there was some success with an experiment with a cat that he had, a cat that was actually his own cat. So again, you've got this sort of link of it being something that he's emotionally connected to. So yeah, this is, I think where we're going now is more this idea. We've moved away in terms of what takes place when we're in an out-of-body experience from this kind of thing with the silver cord to actually, as many people nearly experience something like this, like a sphere type shape. In my experiences, I often do not have a body, and I will often just be like a point or a sphere like that. And commonly when I talk to people, it's already happened since I've been here. People will describe that in their out-of-body experience, they didn't have a body, they were just a sort of a ball of energy or a point of perception or something like that. So it's around 50 to 60% experience a body, but that means that the other 40 to 50% are experiencing something else. So I tend to think that the more experiences we have and the more we go through the process, the more we move towards not having a very defined sense of a body, because I think we break down the sense of self. This is me at 16 or about 15, 16, and this is a drawing I did at about 14 of one of my experiences. So you can see at that time, excuse the bad art, I'm not a particularly good drawer, but the colour and the sense of the body was very strong in those early experiences. It was very auric, it had lots of qualities that you hear about in that kind of context. But now my experiences are much more, don't have that same kind of sense. So in my early experiences, I would use physical landmarks around London to try and navigate, to try and control how the experience worked. So from that book that I mentioned, the Janet Lee Mitchell book, I read a really basic technique in the back of the book on how to have an out-of-body experience. And it was basically floating on a cloud. You just had to sort of imagine this. And I now know it was a really bad technique, but at the time it was basically all I had. So I practiced this technique diligently for the next 6 months, night after night, without fail. I didn't miss a single day. Every single night I was doing this floating on a cloud technique. And I was basically at the point of giving up. I felt like I wasn't actually going to get there. But I sort of wanted to continue with the discipline because I think I'd set in my mind that I was going to try for a year. So anyway, I laid down that particular night and I just kind of gave up in a way, but because I gave up, because I surrendered to the experience, I then was able to induce my first intentionally induced out-of-body experience. And then basically in the months that followed, I would focus on distinctive places. So Regent Street in London, if you see it from above, it's a big curving street. You can see in the curvature of it. So it's very, very distinctive. I grew up around, I could walk to Regent Street in about 20 minutes from where I grew up. I grew up right in the centre of London. And also St Paul's Cathedral was also a very significant landmark that I could focus in on. So I would use these places to try and control my movement, because movement was very difficult in the early experiences. So this is a recent experience that I had in Tallinn. I wanted to talk about some of the experiences that I had that sort of verified the objectivity of the out-of-body experience, because I think early on I wasn't sure whether I believed that it was a real thing. I thought maybe it was a hallucination or something like that. But all through my out-of-body experiences, I've had, on rare occasions, I have these kind of peak experiences where everything comes together and I'm able to perceive things very accurately. So on this particular occasion, I now live in Tallinn. So on this particular occasion, I live in the old town and I was on the far side of Tallinn, and I basically came out of my body, moved into the main hall. This was in kind of November. I moved into the main square, and as I moved into the main square, I saw them hoisting the fir tree into place for Christmas, basically. So I saw all this very vividly. I saw the positions of all the people as they were hoisting the tree. So then, after the out-of-body experience, I basically got dressed, went straight out and walked to the main square, and I saw that they were hoisting the tree as I'd seen in the experience. Another experience that happened more recently in Tallinn was basically, I was living around here in the old town, and I came over the old town and went down the back of the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, which is this cathedral up here. I came down the back side, which as you can see in the image, it's kind of it's all surrounded by trees, but there's also the Parliament building, which is kind of here, and you can only see that street. Basically, if you're on it, you can't see it from any other vantage point unless you're in the air above it. So I came up, over and down like this, and I saw that there was damage and tarpaulin and a repair work going on a specific side, specific point of the building. So then afterwards, I wrote all the details down, and I was able to go back and verify exactly what I'd seen, the colours, everything as I'd seen in the experience. And I wrote everything down before I actually went there. So my partner verified like everything that I said, and she even visualised everything in the same kind of context based upon what I'd said. Okay, so other types of out-of-body experiences I've had have really kind of blurred the sense of what's physical and what's non-physical. I guess in a lot of the experiences I'm describing, there's this sense of you're in the physical environment and it's very, very like physical reality. But in this experience, although it started in a very physical type environment, I'd been at the New Forest all day in England, and then I travelled home. I was very exhausted. I wasn't mentally exhausted, but I was physically exhausted from the travelling, which is quite a good state to be in to induce an OBE. So I laid down on my bed, and almost instantly I went into an out-of-body experience. I didn't have a feeling of leaving the body or anything like that. It was just like bam, and I was moving over treetops, so through a kind of, this kind of treed, tunnelled kind of environment. And I homed in my perception on a flower, and my whole perception seemed to zoom in on it. I'll mention this a few times as I go through types of experiences I've had, because there seems to be this kind of zooming effect where my perception gets very, very close to something, so I'm sort of looking at one part of the detail of it. But in this particular experience, it didn't stop there, and basically my vision, my perception went right into the structure of the flower. It was like I could see the life energy, the fluids, everything moving up the stem. It was like basically like my consciousness kind of bound with the plant that I was looking at. So this was a very sort of beautiful, poignant experience that I had early on as well. Another example of a verified experience. This one was quite significant because I was able to get multiple pieces of information that supported that the experience was objective. I basically went to Lancaster Road in London. I travelled in the out-of-body experience. It started near Marble Arch, which I don't know if any of you know London, but it's quite central. And then I moved along Bayswater Road, which runs next to Hyde Park. And then I came down into Lancaster Road, and as I went into Lancaster Road, I saw the W11. Now, as I just mentioned with the zooming effect, I didn't see the whole street name, Lancaster Gate. I only saw, or Lancaster Road, I'm sorry. I only saw W11. It was like my perception had zoomed right into that detail. Then I continued along and I went into the upper floor of a terraced house, like 2-level house. And I was standing in a kind of office room. There was a table laid out with kind of office papers and all the sort of paraphernalia of an office. This was in the 90s, so there wasn't computers and things like that particularly. It was more still like handwritten paper and things like that. And there was a letterhead, and I saw the name of the person who lived there. So basically I had the rough location of where I was, the postcode, and also the name of the person. So then when I came out of the out-of-body experience, I got the yellow pages, which was the phone directory in those days, and I was able to confirm that that person did live at that address. And I also later a few days later I retraced the route on foot, so I went all the way back there. And another interesting point, I'd never been to that street before. It was a street, an area that I'd never been to. Okay, probably my most intense and powerful experience happened in 1999. I was giving a workshop. I was teaching a new technique that I just developed. It's called the G technique, which basically uses physical muscle tension, muscle exhaustion, combined with breathing techniques similar to yoga. I was teaching this technique, and I basically became quite overwhelmed, and I went straight down onto the floor. It was almost like I was going to faint. I went down onto the floor, and as soon as I got to floor level, I started having an out-of-body experience. Initially, I was moving through a kind of jungle type environment, and there was kind of water running and like a kind of tunnel with trees and plants and things like that. But then the experience seemed to break, and it went from this natural environment to suddenly I was standing on this corner, and I couldn't get a very good image of it, unfortunately, but this is Old Compton Street and this is Moore Street in London. And basically I was standing here. I was kind of rooted to the spot. I didn't move my legs at all. I did have a sense of a body in this experience. I was looking down the street. Everything was blue-grey. It was like I was looking through a blue-grey filter. Looking straight down the street, and then suddenly on the right-hand side, about 175, 200 meters away, there was an explosion came out from the right-hand side of the street. And I saw a man run past me on my right-hand side. I looked to my right, and across the road I saw the Polo Bar, which was a restaurant that was in that area, so it again confirmed where I literally was in a physical context. Then basically I felt this emotional wave, like I was feeling all the emotions of the people who'd been hurt in this explosion that happened. And as I felt that, I came back to my body, but I was in this kind of, I wasn't fully alert again, I was still in this sort of in-between state. And then one of the people there coaxed me out of that, and I related what I'd seen, the bombing, the explosion. And then basically 5 days later, there was a bombing exactly on that same location. And these are two witnesses who were there when I had the out-of-body experience. Because I was having the out-of-body experience in a workshop context, essentially, there were other people there and I told them what I'd seen. So, and this guy is a skeptic. You know, he's very skeptical of all this kind of thing, but he even agrees that it's true. So that's another example. Okay, so some other powerful experiences that I've had include an experience where I found myself in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. This image is almost identical to what I remember seeing in the experience. I looked for quite a while to find the closest thing I could, and the angle, the kind of height, everything is really close to what I saw in the out-of-body experience. Obviously I can't sort of verify that, but the vividness of it was on this rare level, this kind of peak level that rarely happens in these kinds of experiences. Another experience into space, this one was really interesting because to some degree I was able to verify it. It started off in an environment like this image. As you can see, the surface of that looks quite kind of smooth, and if you think about images that you've probably seen of the moon, like our local moon, the local moon usually looks rougher and a bit different to this. But I remembered as I was moving over this lunar type environment, the surface didn't look like what I remembered our local moon to look like. So I was kind of thinking this is somewhere different. I don't know where, but it was somewhere different. Then I came upon a kind of a very distinct ridge running through the moon. And then the next part of the experience, as I continued on, I was just moving over the landscape. I saw this discoloration. So it had three distinctive features that that I wondered after the experience, is there a moon that looks like that in our atmosphere? I mean, in our solar system. And interestingly, there's only one, and it's Iapetus, the third largest moon of Saturn. So that experience is an example of an out-of-body experience to a location that you couldn't normally verify, but in a sense I was able to confirm what I saw to some degree because of the nature of its distinct qualities. So another aspect of the out-of-body experience is when people perceive you or they see some kind of apparition or something like that. So I've had 2, maybe 3 experiences where someone has seemed to react to me while I was out of body. The first instance of that happened actually in a similar area to the Bayswater experience, where it started near Marble Arch in London, and I moved into a big white marble. If you've ever been to that part of London, there's very big grand houses. I went into the first floor of that, and a Muslim Middle Eastern woman walked into a kind of big living room. She walked in and I think the dog reacted or something as well, but anyway, she looked straight at me, and then she threw her hands like that as if she was praying or doing some kind of, and she seemed to be reacting directly to me. Now, in all my other experiences, people had just moved past me or even through me and things like that, and I'd never had a sense that anyone was aware of me being present. But that was the first time that happened. And then more recently, 2009, I had an experience where I went to a place in Tallinn where I'd been staying, but I'd gone back to England to visit my family. And while I was in England, I had an experience where I went back to where I'd been staying. When I returned physically to the place, they all said that they'd seen, there was about 4 of them said that they'd seen a kind of shadow form of me at the location. And this idea of a shadow figure is really common when people are seen during an out-of-body experience. This is one of my students. And when I was teaching him, I mentioned to him that it's a really good idea to involve other people in your learning process. So rather than just trying to do everything on your own, it's good to have a support structure. It's good to have other people helping you to sort of keep on track and to keep the discipline of learning, to have experiences. So he involved his whole family, which wasn't really what I meant, but he decided to involve his children and basically his brother, his wife. He involved everyone. And on this particular night, he had an out-of-body experience, and he went into the kitchen of his house, and he saw this shadow figure, small shadow figure, coming into the kitchen. Now he didn't know how to react to it. Unfortunately, some people, when they see a sort of shadowy figure, they get scared and they just go back to their body, or they don't continue with the experience. But Esteban is a very, very positive person. He's very, very upbeat, and he wasn't fazed by this at all. So he went up to this figure, and when he got close to the figure, he realised that it was his son that he was interacting with. Now, the interesting thing about this, the next morning, he was in the kitchen again, physically, and the little boy came running into the kitchen. This was witnessed by his wife, who's a psychiatrist and also sceptical of these things. The little boy came running in to say that he'd had his first ever out-of-body experience, and that he'd seen his, he said that he'd seen a tall, he wasn't sure whether it was Esteban or his brother, but he again saw a tall shadow figure. So again, he didn't see the physical form or any kind of features. He saw a shadow. So they both saw each other as shadow figures. So there seems to be a consistency with that. Okay, so the visual perception side of these kinds of experiences, this is an example. This is the closest I could get to how the environment looked when I saw that Soho precognitive out-of-body experience. I mean, there are other interpretations. You don't have to take it precognitively. It could have been some kind of deep telepathy or something like that. There are other ways to interpret it, but either way, what I saw was all tinted with this blue-grey. And the interesting thing is I've had 2 precognitive out-of-body experiences, one of the 7/7 bombing and one of the one I just told you about, the Soho bombing. And they both had this blue-grey quality. And the other blue-grey experience I had was the one where I mentioned going into the office and seeing the paperwork and things like that. So it seems these blue-grey experiences are very significant, but I've only had 3 of them in hundreds of out-of-body experiences since I was 12 years old. So it's they're pretty rare, but very interesting when they happen. The more common type of experience that has what we call veridical evidence, verifiable, accurate evidence, comes in this kind of yellow-green type perception. It's almost like everything's filled with sunlight or filled with energy. It's almost analogous to what you hear described in near-death experiences and those kinds of accounts, when people see everything seeming to be alive and full of consciousness and things like that. So the experience I had over Tallinn, where I was able to perceive things accurately over Tallinn, had this yellow, full of light, yellow and greens kind of quality to it. And this happens far more commonly than the blue-grey. The weirdest or most unusual type of perception that I have is this. It's almost like seeing the auras. This is the closest I could come. This is kind of heat imagery. It's not quite accurate. It's more like you're seeing the auric signature of a place. I tend to see mainly buildings when I'm in this state. Interestingly, people don't show up very much. It's almost like it has to be something that's accumulated some kind of energy over a long period of time. So the first place that I ever saw with this quality was a children's hospital that I used to go to as a kid on occasion, and the building seemed to be glowing when I went past it in the out-of-body experience. So what I found about these colour qualities within the experiences is that they seem to correspond with the visible light spectrum. I realised that they were pairs of colour that seem to correspond to, so you've got the red and the orange, you've got the green and the yellow, and you've got the sort of blue-grey kind of down there. Also, I've written early stages in the kind of dark area, because often when people have their first out-of-body experiences, they might not necessarily even see anything. It might be almost like they're in darkness, or they can feel and maybe they can hear, or maybe they can have some kind of sense of things, but they can't literally see anything. So that's very common as well. And then of course there's also the state where you basically see the same as you do physically. It's everything looks normal, so that would be all of the qualities of the light spectrum. So I think that there might be something in looking into that more. It's kind of where I want to go with my own research. I'm trying to look into, there's been a lot of talk about connections with out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and things like that, with electromagnetism, with different ideas around things being affected. Sometimes people who've had a near-death experience, they'll seem to affect electrical objects afterwards. Penny Sartori in the UK, who's a near-death experience researcher, she's currently looking at that particular area because she did a 5-year study on near-death experiences, and then found that many of the people she'd researched were going out, and electrical items would just stop working and would be disrupted and things like that. So I think maybe there's a sort of crossover between the two. And for a long time, parapsychologists were sort of rejecting the idea that psi could have anything to do with electromagnetism, but I think now it's starting to come back in through areas like hidden sector matter, which is an idea from string theory. So it's kind of, some researchers are starting to be more open that it could be related, but in a different way to how it was thought to be related before. Okay, so to talk more about the near-death experience type area, I wanted to talk about the type of things that people generally report seeing. This is consistent with my experiences, but I don't know anyone who's actually looked at the specifics of what people see when they have a near-death or an out-of-body experience. And it seems to be that the most common things people accurately or veridically describe are small three-dimensional objects. So this is one, I'm listing some of the most famous cases from near-death research here. So there's the Kimberly-Clark Sharp case of basically a woman had a cardiac arrest. To cut a long story short, she went outside the hospital and she was able to perceive a shoe. Now that's, as far as I'm aware, is exactly the type of shoe it was. It was a kind of Converse kind of tennis shoe, and it was blue like that. She saw this shoe on the window ledge of the hospital, and then when she came back to her body, she reported this, and Kimberly-Clark Sharp went and checked this out, and she actually found that there was a shoe physically there outside the hospital, which you couldn't see unless you literally went outside and looked for it. So that's one famous case. Probably the most famous near-death experience case, I'm sure some of you will know of it, is the Pam Reynolds case. This is the exact model of drill that was being used on her skull. Basically, the blood was drained out of her, she was having an operation, and they put her into a state of semi-controlled cardiac arrest, if you like. They kind of slowed everything down to the point that she was basically dead, so they could do this brain operation on her. Now, they were using this drill on her skull, and she had an out-of-body experience and perceived what was happening to her, and described the drill that was being used on her as looking like an electric toothbrush. I think you can see what she meant. So I think that's another example. And then I spoke to Pim van Lommel about what he felt was his best case in terms of veridical evidence from his research. Pim van Lommel is a very well-known researcher in near-death experience research from the Netherlands, and he said that a case of a 44-year-old man with dentures, I find that bizarre that he was 44 and had dentures, but there you go. But basically his dentures were removed as he had a cardiac arrest, and they were placed into the nurse's cart and then removed from the area. He perceived all of this, and he even recognised the nurse that had removed the dentures, even though he'd actually been, he was having a cardiac arrest at the time. So it seems very unlikely that he would know. But the important thing is, again, there's this idea of the three-dimensional or zooming in. So either it's a small three-dimensional object that people describe, or there's this zooming effect. And I think this zooming effect, or these small objects, are really interesting in terms of, if we want to do more research, if we want to kind of show that out-of-body experiences are real, or that near-death experiences are real, then we need to kind of think about the design of the experiments and how to show what people are seeing. So an experience I had that seemed to verify the idea of some kind of afterlife or some kind of near-death experience was what Raymond Moody is now calling a shared death experience. Basically in the 90s, in 96, I had an out-of-body experience where I didn't find myself in a physical environment. I found myself in this completely misty, otherworldly environment. This image, again, was about the closest I could find to what it looked like, but imagine 150 or so people rather than the few people that you can see there. So there was around 150 or so people, and I was at a distance like this, I don't know, about 100, 150 meters away from them, and they seemed to be confused. They were kind of looking around. Some of them seemed to know each other, some of them not. As I looked at them, as I focused on individuals, I seemed to see glimpses of memories, and it was almost like I was seeing their life review. If you've heard about NDE research, people often describe a life review where they see their whole life flash before their eyes. It was almost like I was seeing glimpses of this, which told me things about them and their kind of lives. I got like the sense that, for example, that they were Europeans, or they weren't English speakers. They weren't from the US or anything like that. And I watched them all, and I watched them go through this process, and some of them started to sort of disappear into the mist at the back. Some of them seemed to sort of drift off, and some of them seemed to still be going through this kind of life review type situation. So they were still sort of struggling. So there seemed to be different levels or different stages that people were going through in the experience. I couldn't get any closer, which was interesting as well. I've heard this described in near-death experiences where people feel that if they cross a barrier, if they go too far, then they won't be able to come back. And I felt as well that I couldn't get any closer. If I did, maybe I'd be drawn into it or something like that. I don't know. But afterwards, I found that the actual event took place in this island called, I'm not sure how you pronounce it properly, but Svalbard in Norway. Now, interestingly, I just remembered this as Norway from the 90s, and it was only recently when I started working on my third book that I found that that it was specifically on this island, which was interesting to me because basically I had another experience that related to that island, which I'll get to. But this is the site of a plane crash that happened on the exact day at the time that I was having the out-of-body experience, and the amount of people that died matched with the amount of people I'd seen in my experience. So everything seemed to be consistent, as if I'd basically shared the initial dying process of this 140 or so people who died in this crash. So I've always been kind of intrigued I've never been there, but I've always been intrigued to kind of go there, but then to kind of make things even more kind of interesting and linked to this site. Recently, in 2014, I had another out-of-body experience that started over this structure, the seed bank. I didn't know that there was even such a thing. I didn't even know that this existed. But I was up above this sort of pointed black structure. I didn't really know what it was. I knew I was in the Arctic sort of region somewhere because everything was Arctic-like. It was all snow and ice, and I was very high up above, sort of drifting over this environment, and I was moving to the east, away from this structure, and then the next thing I saw was basically an island that I remember thinking, if I can remember some of the details of what the places look like, I can maybe retrace it. I can maybe find out where I was exactly. So I came over this island and I sort of logged it in my memory as looking like a boot. So an island in the Arctic that looked like a boot that was facing the opposite way to Italy was kind of how I remembered it. So I saw this, and then interestingly, to connect with Finland as well, the experience, I came down from this island and I went somewhere into the north of Finland, and I saw a man who looked very much like him, who was standing looking, seemed to be looking at me. There was also a big log, kind of pyramid type sort of log cabin behind him. And I was standing there, I came down onto the ground, I was standing and he was looking at me, this figure was looking at me, or seemed to be looking at me. He didn't sort of say anything or register that he could see me, but he was looking right where I was. And I don't know what was behind me, maybe there was like a big area of kind of scenery or something, I don't know. But I remember feeling a really powerful emotional connection or feeling, and then that seemed to bring me out of the experience. People often, if you get too emotional, you have too much of an emotional response, that can end the experience. So I came out of the experience after that, basically. Okay, so I wanted to get more into some of the scientific research that I've been involved with. So some of the theories of what's going on that I find interesting. My friend, colleague, Anthony Peake has this idea of what he calls the intrasomatic model, which is basically an idea that the out-of-body experience isn't taking place out of the body, but is actually almost like an internalized experience. But if you think about things like virtual reality, if all of your senses were being, covered by something else, if you were perceiving imagery from somewhere else, sound from somewhere else, sensory experience from somewhere else, while you were physically somewhere else, it would feel like you've actually travelled to another location. So you would experience being in another place, but actually you haven't gone anywhere. So his idea of the out-of-body experience is almost like that we're kind of connecting to this bigger sort of virtual reality. Tom Campbell as well has this idea of the larger consciousness system, that we're connecting to a bigger system. Then there's the OOBE idea. I don't know if any of you know of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They have this idea that's kind of similar to Anthony Peake. A lot of people are going with this idea that some kind of quantum effect is what's taking place and allowing near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences. His idea works with the microtubules, very, very low-level structures of cells. They're not just in the brain, they're also in the rest of the body as well. So that could almost be a way to think about how there could be some kind of body or something like that. So, but what his idea is that somehow there's a kind of interconnection, like quantum entanglement or something like that, through these microtubule levels of the cells, and that maybe, if that's the case, then you could have a double brain. You could have a quantum brain, or you could have a quantum consciousness, or a quantum something that can exist separately from you. Because in non-locality, you have this idea that things can be separated at any distance. He's also, very qualified to talk about this. He's not some, person who knows nothing about science. And I've also spoken to Brian Josephson about this idea, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics. So I think he knows about physics too. And he thinks that it probably is some kind of biological, his theory is called biological utilization of quantum non-locality, which basically is just what I explained, this idea that biological systems can be entangled. And I think there's increasing evidence for that. There's research in Milan, for example, that's shown entanglement across cells in petri dishes and things like that. So, and then Celia Green was probably one of the significant early researchers. She had these different definitions, like somatic, and they basically just mean out of body or alongside. She had this idea, like I was mentioning at the beginning, that you can have this sense of not having a body and just being like a travelling consciousness, or you can be more like a sense of a self, like a separated self, a sense of a physical or semi-physical being. So these are the kind of different ideas basically around that. So some of the research I've done, some of you might know Rupert Sheldrake. We've worked together on a few projects. We did some quite in-depth research. This was part of a telepathy study that was part of his Perrott Warwick research. I basically organised all of this. We used this underground bunker. As you can see, it looked like a bit of a dungeon. But the reason for that is Rupert had a lot of criticism that people could have been cheating. They could have been getting the information by getting on their mobile phones or using some kind of gadget or something like that. So he wanted to do some research in a place where there was no signal. You couldn't get a signal. So we basically found a bunker. And we had this room that had like a big steel door. It was thick concrete and brick walls. And we basically put all the subjects in there, and just to make it even more 100%, we had a special device that blocks mobile phone signals within 100 meters. So we had that in the room, and they didn't know that was in there. So even if they walked outside, they still wouldn't have been able to use their phone. But they were basically in this, they were shut in this room. I would put them in there and then sit outside while they did the experiment. And there was a randomized phone call would come, and basically they would have to say who they psychically felt was on the other end of the phone, and then it was statistically evaluated to how accurate they were. The piece of paper he's got is basically has a number for each of his relatives, and he can pick the number of the person he thinks is on the other end of the phone. In 2014, I also went to the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I should mention, I also took part in some experiments with Rupert as well. But this, I wasn't organising the experiments, but I took part as a subject in Dean Radin's experiments with micro PK. So he was using the quantum double slit experiment, where he was shooting photons through the double slit, and you had to sit in his. Oh, I got a, no, I haven't. You had to sit in this kind of. It was essentially like a Faraday cage. Again, it cut out all magnetic fields and things like that. So you would sit in there in this locked room, and my instruction was to try to affect the photons going through the system. He just published this study quite recently, and he had positive results from all the, I think nearly all the subjects that he worked with, because some of his studies he uses the general public, but some of the studies he only uses people like very experienced meditators and things like that, which I also am. I've done Zazen meditation since about 1992, so that's another sort of thing. But yeah, and it came out in my study with positive results in the predicted direction. So positive for psi abilities or psi. Oh, and I should also mention that device I'm looking at there is his online experiment. So it's not running anymore, sadly, but he has an online version of this experiment, so people could just try to affect the system. We actually did an experiment where I tried to have an out-of-body experience to that online device and try to make it go wildly out of the predicted direction. So it took me about 3 or 4 months to have an experience that I could attempt it, but I attempted it, but we don't have the results for that yet, sadly. Dean Radin's very busy with other things. So another area of my work is creating immersive technology that's designed to help induce out-of-body experiences. So this was the first structure I made in 1998, which used a suspended platform to give the person more of a sense of floating and being out of the body. And then it had an early form of sound technology and also a hypnotic induction. So it had several elements to it to try and sort of help the person have a kind of something like the feeling of being in an out-of-body experience. And what happened with a lot of people is that they would then go home that night after being in it and then have an out-of-body experience. So it was almost like it worked like a big hypnotic suggestion, like being in this structure for a period of time kind of tuned them in to the experience. Which is very much like flotation tanks and things like that, which I also have done some research with. This is a flotation, you can't really see very well, but behind me there's a flotation, it's the largest flotation tank that is on the market basically, and that's in a centre in Tallinn, and I've done some work there as well, trying to improve the chances of OBEs taking place by using things like flotation. Again, people don't tend to have an OBE while in the tank, but if they've done the training and then they do the flotation, it will help the chances that they'll have an out-of-body experience when they go home afterwards. It also leaves you very, very relaxed if you've never been in one. They're really great for deeply relaxing. So another area I've researched is virtual reality, again as a way to access these, to create a change in someone's consciousness, to create a sort of altered state. So I did some research at UCL in London. They've got a cave. You can see in that image, that's what it looks like. It just looks like a blank cave, but it's projected like this from multiple sides. So you can basically move around in the environment and everything interacts and reacts to you. So it's a really great system, but I wanted to take it a step further. So I was lucky enough to get commissioned by the Science Museum in London, and I created a larger scale version. This was like a very large room in the Science Museum. Sorry, got a bit of a sore throat. In the Science Museum, and the screen was wrapped around you, and as you moved around it, it would interact with you. There was full stereoscopic 3D. So it was like Avatar and those kinds of 3D films, but this was in 2004, so this was quite a long time before that technology became mainstream. You can't really see the image. There's not much point showing you that because it was all doubled because it was in 3D, but it was based around my out-of-body experiences that happened in London. So I kind of recreated that for people going to the Science Museum. Here's a sort of idea, but again, like I said, you can see it's all doubled, but that's sort of, another image of the installation. So my next avenue with all of this is this structure, is my next project. I want to create a 4-person at a time experience that uses all of the things that I found are useful for out-of-body experiences, and sort of combine them all together into one structure. So I'm trying to get funding and take this project a bit further. So that's the future, basically. That's the next stage. So yeah, if people want to find out more about my work, I've written 2 books. Avenues of the Human Spirit is my own personal experiences and more about my own journey and spiritual kind of ideas. Navigating the out-of-body experience is the techniques and all the practical stuff. It looks at all this immersive technology. It looks at all of the more holistic approach, because I don't focus on one way to induce an out-of-body experience. I look at it more as you need to have all of the elements in place in your life. That's why one person can do a technique and they'll be successful straight away, and another person can do the exact same technique and get nowhere. I think it's because they need to look at their levels of stress in their life. They need to look at whether their mind is focused on achieving it, whether they have a positive mental attitude, whether they've addressed fears, things like that. Then it's much more effective to get there. And finally, there's an online course. If people go to my website, grahamnicholls.com, there's a download 11 hours of tuition on how to have OBEs, and the infraliminal technology is basically the sound technology that was used in my immersive structures, like I mentioned, that I started developing in '98. So, yeah, that's it. If anyone has any questions.